Before we conduct a more thoroughgoing investigation of how connectionist modelers approach the field of human development, I'd like to unpack some of those terms we just met in the last video. So we noted that the empirical agenda places great emphasis on the relative unformed nature of the young human infant. And among all animals, humans have the longest period of immaturity, the longest period in which they are helpless and in need of the care and attention of caregivers, usually parents. There's a great deal of diversity among animals as to how ready they are to take care of themselves at birth. One can make a distinction between altricial animals, who are relatively helpless at birth, often lacking furs, feathers, clothes, and precocial animals, like the word precocious, who, when they're born, have such skills as the ability to walk, to seek shelter, to feed themselves. Humans belong firmly in the altricial group, but it's worth noting that this distinction, contrary to the suggestion that one might infer from the way this is treated in the empiricist's point of view, this distinction is not one of intelligence or of similarity to humans. The skill sets that are involved, the ability to walk, feed, and so on, take care of yourself, seem to depend more on the environmental niche occupied by the species in question. So to put it bluntly, if you're an antelope and you're born in the savannah and you don't get up and walk, you'll be eaten very, very clearly. Different environmental niches offer different sets of resources and different threats as well. Humans, of course, have shaped their own environment largely. We have constructed, as it were, protective layers around us to ensure that we don't face threats from predators. And while we're developing, different parts of the body develop at different rates. And at birth, most of the body is relatively fully formed. Some parts of the body are still developing, though. The liver is still developing for a while. The bones of the skull are still developing for a while. But the brain is still becoming the organ that it will be for a long time. And in fact, the front part of the brain, the so-called prefrontal cortex, is the latest part to complete its biological development, and that doesn't happen until approximately 21 years of age. There's a great deal of uncertainty in such figures. Now, as this is developing, this is biological development, over those years, whether we peg it at 21 or 18, over those years the child is also becoming a fully encultured, linguistic member of a human society. So in this way, the biological development of the brain is inextricably entangled with matters to do with culture, social organization, and the influence of family. So this makes it impossible really to peel apart in any neat way the separate influences of what we might call, very simplistically, nature and nurture. Everyone agrees that by the time the development is done, this 18, 21-year-old person has lots and lots of different capacities. They can ride a bike, play the piano, all that kind of thing. So this all requires certain kinds of determinate structure to emerge in the brain. And the question is, where do these specific structures come from? An answer that won't work is to suggest that the genes are responsible for it all. But if we rely very heavily on the biology, we're attributing a great deal of importance to genetics. The structure can't really be understood as simply coming from the outside to a blank slate of a child, but we have to instead understand this dance between child and environment. And we have to consider how the structure emerges. And the term emergence appears here now as a slightly technical term, which I'd like to just unpack a little bit. It's sometimes dropped into discussions as a kind of a fairy dust, as something which pretends to be an explanation, but isn't really. We have many words like that. Instinct is another one. Emergence is not magic, and it is a well-defined concept in mathematical and physical sciences. We have a great deal of technical vocabulary which can help us to understand patterns that we see emerging without designers, without central control. It's a very close relative to the notion of self-organization, which seems appropriate when we're talking about the goings-on of the living. What we're doing when we describe a resultant property as emergent is we're saying it wasn't designed, there was no guiding teleos or purpose to it, and no controlling agency. And debate around such matters of controllers, design, and agency are some of the fundamental philosophical questions that science has grappled with for 2,000 years. So let's just look at some examples of emergence and see how this word can be used well, so that you can spot when it's been used loosely. A soap bubble gives a nice example of an emergent phenomenon. The sphericity of the soap bubble arises on the basis of local interactions between molecules, none of which have any access to anything resembling three-dimensional geometry. The local interactions produce a form which minimizes the surface tension. So there are attractive forces between adjacent molecules that produce a kind of a tension, and the spherical form that we see turns out to be the form that minimizes this tension. Now, minimizing something is very often the principle that will be appealed to when we see something highly differentiated resulting in the world. The hexagonal design of the cells in the bee honeycomb likewise seem not to emerge from any blueprints or plans that the bees have, and when one looks at the various ways one could have of packing the space that's available to the bees, given the material constraints that operate there, what we see is that the space for the purposes of the bees seems to be maximally economical in its use of building materials. So what we have here are simple organizational principles. So those are things like the interactions among local molecules, among neighboring molecules, under appropriate environmental constraints. So the distribution of tension throughout the whole mixture, for example, gives rise to structure and order. This form of explanation is not a simple example of cause and effect. And science has given up on simple accounts of cause and effect. This causes that. Such stories are always gross simplifications. Rather, what we see are multiple interacting processes that generate structures of various kinds. Now, when we get into the world of emergence, there's a problem with the language, to be honest with you. There's a lot of jargon goes around, and the jargon might lead you to believe that emergent phenomena are somehow not really real. So I'd like to jargon bust a little bit with the help of this fine video, which illustrates an emergent phenomenon. I'll let you watch it first and then we'll discuss it.
Scotty Pinwheel! Scotty Pinwheel! That's right.
So, this little video is quite memorable because you can easily attach the key theoretical terms to the elements that you're seeing. So the puppy dogs here are energetic components. Each of them is independent and autonomous in its own way, and each of them is driven, in this case by hunger. The role of environmental constraints is played here by the circular feeding dish. In the absence of the circular feeding dish, you don't get the resulting pattern. In the absence of the puppies, you don't get the resulting pattern. Put these two together, and an engine of some sort, in this case the excited feeding behavior of the puppies, and a pinwheel emerges. The pinwheel pattern is entirely real. There's nothing unreal about the pinwheel pattern, though no component tries to achieve a pinwheel or has any awareness that there is a pinwheel. So the pinwheel is the emergent, the dog is the component, and the circular feeding dish is the constraint. Let's come back to our spherical soap bubbles. At a micro level, at the level of the molecules, here we're talking about components, like the puppy dogs. At the micro level, in a soap bubble, we've got local pressure differences. There's an internal pressure pushing out, and we've got molecules which are pulling on each other. So this is all going on locally for the individual molecules. At the emergent level, the resulting form is the smallest possible surface area that can enclose a given volume. And usually, when we want to understand the link between an emergent form and the components and the constraints and their forms of interaction, we don't think in terms of simple cause and effect. Rather, we look for some general organizing principle, something which is being optimized. Surface area, energy spent, resources consumed, and the like. Another frequently discussed example of emergence is the Rayleigh-Bernard phase transition. You may be familiar with this from the behavior of oil in a frying pan. When you pour oil into a cold frying pan, it's heterogeneous. It looks the same everywhere. And when you heat it up, you see characteristic patterns of ripples and rolls and formations in the pan. Now, one can turn that into a well-regulated scientific model by taking fluids and constraining them between two surfaces and then applying a temperature gradient across them. And what you see is that initially there's only one state of the liquid, just like the oil in a cold frying pan. There's only one place for it to go. It's homogeneous. There's nothing going on. But after the temperature gradient passes a critical threshold, there's a sudden macroscopic change throughout the liquid in which convection rolls arise. And there's two possible configurations of these. A given molecule has no idea where it's going to land, but it ends up either in a clockwise going or a counterclockwise going roll. So the macroscopic property here that is illustrated in the manner that physicists and engineers use, using a thing called a potential function. So V here is a potential function, which describes the overall state of the preparation. And on the left-hand side, you can see there's only one minimum to this potential function. The addition of the temperature gradient can now be understood as distorting this potential function, ultimately producing the form you see on the right-hand side, in which there are two minima, and the system as a whole will fall into one or other of these two minima. And deciding which one it goes into is random, because that will be decided by a chance event at the microscopic level, at the level of the individual atoms. But afterwards, we know for a fact we will find it in either one state or another. The term phase transition refers to this macroscopic reorganization. Here's another nice video example of the spontaneous emergence of order in a box of nails. So, who sorted those nails? Did the person shaking the box sort the nails? Did the nails sort themselves? A simple cause and effect story, A causes B, won't work here. Rather, what we see is that the order within the nail container arises through local interactions among the nails in the presence of agitation, that's the engine that drives it, and the appropriate constraints. These nails won't order themselves if they're not shaken within the confines of a walled container. Here's one more example of emergence from a beautiful study done by Hoyt and Taylor, reported in Nature in 1981. This plot is a great example of scientific illustration because there's a great deal of information conveyed in a single figure, and I'll walk you through the parts of this figure. In this experiment, 3 ponies, small horses, were placed on treadmills, and they were very, very good ponies indeed. They were willing to walk, trot, and gallop at a variety of speeds set by the experimenter, all the while with a big bag over their nose measuring their oxygen consumption. And the question experimenters were interested in is, can they walk, trot, or gallop at arbitrary speeds, or are there constraints that apply here? And if we look first at the top left hand, in the scatter plot, the triangles are data points showing oxygen consumption per meter travelled while walking at a variety of speeds. The range of speeds is shown at the bottom. And you can see that the amount of oxygen consumed per meter travel varies very sensitively with the speed. And in fact, there is one optimal value, one walking speed at which oxygen consumption is minimized. The circles, the open circles that occupy the middle of the top half of the plot, come from trotting. And these ponies were able to trot at a much greater range of speeds than walking. But once more, you can see that the oxygen consumption is greatly affected by the speed at which they trot. And once more, there is an optimal speed at which oxygen consumption is minimized. The data on the right-hand side at the top are from galloping. These are not quite as clear. You can see there's a wide range over which the horses gallop, and you can see a descending function, but there's no ascending arm to this because there's limits to what you can do with horses on treadmills. One can assume that had they been forced to gallop faster, the oxygen consumption would have gone up again. That's the top half of the plot, showing the very interesting results that, depending on the gait, on the biomechanical organization of the horse, there is an optimal speed that one would associate with each gait. At the bottom, the bars are observations of the same horses when they were out in the wild, in the paddock. When they're out in the paddock, they're cheerful little horses, so sometimes they walk, sometimes they trot, sometimes they gallop. And the observations simply record the speed at which they chose, as it were, to walk, trot, and gallop. And what we see is that when they are not being harassed by experimenters, the horses choose to walk, trot, or gallop at those speeds which are energetically optimal, at those speeds at which oxygen consumption is minimized. So you can see more of this principle of optimization as being important in understanding the resultant form. Now, one might conclude wrongly from these data that the horse is optimized to minimize oxygen consumption. That would be too narrow a view. There was a follow-up study done to this in which a different variable was measured, but more or less the same protocol was followed. In this study, they measured hoof strain, that is the strain on the foot of the horse as the foot hits the ground. And hoof strain varies depending on the gait, whether it's walking, trotting, or galloping. And hoof strain varies depending on the speed. And guess what? You generate very, very similar data there. When you consider hoof strain as the variable, then there is an optimal speed for walking, trotting, or galloping. So now you might ask, well, is the horse optimized for oxygen consumption or for hoof strain? Which is it? And here's where the simple cause and effect thinking has driven you wrong. The evolution is a slow process in which millions of variables are being tinkered with all the time. To the extent that we understand it as optimizing anything, it must be optimizing everything all at once. So these two variables provide us with useful peephole insights into the capacities and structures of the developed animal. But they don't provide us with a unique view of causal factors. Rather, they show us that the way that a life form is nested into its life world results from many different processes of optimization. So now we're going to turn to infant development. And one area that has attracted attention is the ability of infants to recognize faces. In human infants and in mammals generally, the very young neonates have a predisposition to attend to things that look sort of like faces. We don't know what they see. They don't see highly differentiated faces and they don't recognize individuals. And from experiments with artificial stimuli and so on, we know that an arrangement with two dots above and something like a mouth below suffices to draw the attention of an infant. If the same elements occur in a different configuration, as on the right-hand side here, they're uninteresting. So this is the kind of generic predisposition that Ellman is talking about. And if one has this predisposition and selectively pays attention to things that have this kind of configuration, you'll end up looking at a lot of faces, and the faces will influence you, and eventually you'll become a highly differentiated, skilled reader of faces. And we can see this interplay. It has been studied intensively in sheep. Some sheep have horns, some sheep don't have horns. If you raise a young sheep among sheep that have horns, it will over time develop a sensitive reaction to the presence of horns. We can find cells in its brain that clearly indicate that this sheep is sensitive to horns on others. If you raise the same sheep among sheep without horns, that does not happen. So the sheep definitely will have a tendency, an innate tendency to attend to the faces of conspecifics, but the details of that emerge then from the interaction between the infant and its environment. This has been studied not only on sheep, of course, but also on humans. Johnson and Morton in 1991 found that newborn infants have a preference for that kind of three contrast blobs, two eyes and a mouth. And they actually prefer that to fully specified faces. That seems to be the kind of lure that will get them to pay attention. Interestingly, as you go through this process, as you begin with a general weak disposition to attend to one thing rather than another, you're not capable of making fine discriminations. As you develop the capacity to make fine discriminations, you become insensitive to some other things. We'll be revisiting this in the next lecture in the domain of language, but an example from face perception comes from Sargent and Nelson, who found that 9-month-old infants can discriminate monkey faces better than adult humans can. Adult humans have, of course, much more experience in telling fine differences among human faces. But with that, they lose the ability to make similar distinctions in monkey faces. So here's a final thought for this video. If you were going to build a connectionist simulation that tried to model the development of infant face perception, what would you build in and what would you expect would come from the data? Here we have something like a built-in predisposition to attend to something, but it's not the fully specified face. And the resulting capacities to make fine distinctions and be very sensitive to human faces arises through the interaction with fully specified real human faces. So there's a trade-off here to be done between the specificity of the model and the precise distinctions that are captured by the data on which the model was trained. We'll turn to human language now in the next video.